Well, take your Bible, turn with me to Daniel chapter 4. A lot of the PowerPoint's going to be, the PowerPoint's going to have a lot of the verses here. And for those that might be joining us online, it's a joy to welcome you to Hillsdale. We just went through a time of prayer for our nation. And I think what we're going to study this morning is pretty appropriate because we are looking at the sovereignty of God, and the greatest of men are as nothing. So let me give you a little bit of a background. By the way, this will be the last study in Daniel. I preached it 2 years ago, so I didn't want to do a lot other than just kind of go over the surface in a survey of it. And if you've read the bulletin letter, starting next Sunday, we actually moved to the New Testament in our daily devotion. So I've gone through about 19 months of Old Testament. So let's go through this. If you have the outline there, they're on the music stand. Daniel chapter 4, I decided to go there because it really is an autobiography of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is one of those Old Testament figures that I sometimes wonder if it's possible that we might meet him in heaven. I don't know. I can't say that for sure. But when we read Daniel chapter 4 and we watch and listen to his praise of God, the God of heaven, it really does give you pause to think, maybe in this time of trial that we find in Daniel chapter 4, maybe his heart really did turn to the Lord and he became a man of faith. But we won't know. When we're on the streets of gold, I don't know that Nebuchadnezzar is going to stick out of the crowd. You know, he's going to be one of the many faces. Let me give you a few thoughts with Nebuchadnezzar. One of the things that you see repeated several times is the Lord referring to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. Let me give you a few instances. Jeremiah 25 and verse 9, the prophet Jeremiah, behold, I will send to take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, at my servant will I bring against this land. Of course, that land would be Judah, the city of Jerusalem. And so God says, I'm going to take Nebuchadnezzar, a heathen king, and I'm going to use him like my servant, and I'm going to bring him against Judah to do what? That my people will know that I'm God. And so God was going to use Nebuchadnezzar to judge his people. Here's another, Jeremiah 27 and verse 6. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. The beast of the field have I given him also to serve him. So here's a thought as we dive into this, is that the kings and prime ministers, the presidents, really are the servants of the Lord. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that they do is within the will of God, but it does mean that God can use even the desires of a heathen king to accomplish his purposes. You know, you and I watched yesterday evening. It was actually my mom called and said, President Trump, there had been an assassination attempt. And I didn't realize it, so I turned the television on. But like you, some of us are old enough, we remember, I was just a little kid when I came home from school, and on the news was Kennedy had been shot. And then I remember, wasn't that many years later, that Robert Kennedy, his brother, was also assassinated. So we've lived through those times. Reagan, it's hard to believe it's been so many years since there was an attempt on Reagan's life. So those kinds of moments in history are really historic moments. And so as you're watching unfold yesterday evening, we have to be reminded that the life of the king and the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. And so yesterday, with none of us can give an explanation of how the president, Trump, turned just enough that he was grazed. It's truly astounding. But now we come to Daniel 4, and we're reminded that the kings and the monarchs of the nations, really can serve and will serve to the end of what God's purposes are. Jeremiah 43 and verse 10 again, and say unto them, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will send and take Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. So I think I've emphasized that enough. Let me move on. All right, like most rulers, Nebuchadnezzar was no stranger to pride. You see that throughout the study, particularly as we come to Daniel chapter 4. Now, my wife told me on, was it Wednesday, that you go so fast, not even I can fill in the blanks. And I told her to speed up, woman. You gotta hit the pedal to the metal. So anyway, let me give you a reminder. Proverbs 16 verse 18, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And the root sin of man, no doubt, goes to pride, right? The temptation of Eve was that ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, and the aspiration to be as God. And then Isaiah 14, you're very much aware of Lucifer being cast out of heaven. And we've studied this earlier, so I'm not going to spend time with it, other than pointing out Isaiah 14 and verse 13. I will ascend, I will exalt, I will sit. Verse 14, I will ascend, I will be like the Most High. And pride is at the heart of our trials and troubles. Pride brings us to the point of our own self-destruction. And then Psalm 10 and verse 2, the wicked in his pride doth persuade the poor, let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined, speaking of the prideful. And then Psalm 10 and verse 4, through the pride of his countenance, he will not seek after God, and God is not in all his thoughts. And so that's why when I pray, and I think you should pray too, for President Trump, what happened to him yesterday can be life-changing. You realize that. And he can be strong and he can pump his fist in public. But don't you know in private, when you know that you were that close to a bullet taking your life, would that not give us pause to look to God? And so that for me, I look at that, and we're going to see this in Nebuchadnezzar's life, that here's an opportunity, Lord, for that president to look to the God of heaven. And what a great change it could make in our nation. So let's not give up on America yet, right? Daniel 4. Daniel 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's testament to the tragedy of sinful pride and what becomes a proud, foolish man when he opposes God. So I'm going to dive into this. So if you have your Bible, some will be on the PowerPoint, some won't. So we're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony. At this point in his life, I can't say for certain how old he is. Nebuchadnezzar reigned over Babylon 43 years. And I'm of the opinion he is probably around the 30th year of his reign as king. And really, he dominates the world. Everything is bowed at his feet. And so he was an incredible ruler. He was a great builder. And so we will see in Daniel 4 then the testament to the tragedy of sinful pride. So I'm going to keep moving. Can I? All right, let's go through this. All right, let me give you some thoughts here. Here's Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Now, this is in his right mind that he is praising the God of heaven. So Nebuchadnezzar, his preamble, Daniel 4, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Now, the purpose, I thought it good, right, says Nebuchadnezzar as Daniel is writing this biography of the king. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders, and notice what it says, that the high God hath wrought toward me. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony of what God has done in his life. Verse 3 then, the king's profession. So we have the preamble, the purpose of his announcement, and now his profession. So here we go, verse 3. How great are his, that is the God of heaven, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. You see, only the God of eternity, only of him Could you say that? That's why I sometimes wonder, and we can all have a different opinion, but if this is not a man that through Daniel's influence came to acknowledge that there is one God, and this God is mighty, this God rules everlasting, and his dominion, his rule is from generation to generation, which really means God's sovereignty never ends. And then Nebuchadnezzar's trepidation. And so, this passage here, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And so we're going to look at the chronological setting of it here then. So I can't remember all this up here, but here we go. Nebuchadnezzar was at rest, he writes, in mine house. So that's why I think he's probably around the 30th year of his reign, because there's no more wars. He is the sovereign of the earth as far as he knows it, and flourishing in my palace. And he says, and I saw a dream, and the thoughts upon which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed, and the visions of my head troubled me. So he is spending, like we'll notice this morning about another king, he's sleepless. He can't go to sleep. His dream has disturbed him. And so we read in verse 6, and therefore made I a decree to bring all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. I don't know how often Nebuchadnezzar dreamed, but remember the last time he had a dream in Daniel chapter 2, and he was going to kill all the wise men. And Daniel said, time out. Let me have some opportunity of fasting and praying, and then I'll come back and tell you the dream and the interpretation. Verse 7, then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But he knows there's somebody else that can tell him the meaning of the dream, and it's in verse 8. And at last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name, according to the name of my God. In other words, I named him according to the gods that I worship, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, verse 9, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Now, if you'll go back and look, and we won't take time, but the first 4 verses where he is praising the God of heaven, the dominion, his everlasting rule. But now when we come to what happened before that profession, we see a heathen king in his expressions and in his observation. And then, beginning in verse 10 and going through verse 15, he begins to tell the dream to Daniel. So I'm going to keep going. You okay? All right, here we go. Verse 10 then. Thus were the visions of mine head in my head, and I saw. And behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. And of course, that tree is representing Nebuchadnezzar and his rule, his kingdom. And he goes on, and he says, and the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. So in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he ruled all the earth. And that is true. All the earth that he was aware of, he was the supreme ruler. And then in verse 12, the leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and it was meat or food for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all the flesh was fed of it. So all the nations of the earth were supplemented and cared for by Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Verse 13, and I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. Now, so here is the intervention of God. Verse 14, now this holy one, he cried aloud, and he said, hew, cut down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. So Nebuchadnezzar being symbolized or typed by the tree In his dream, that tree is to be cut down. So that's going to be the prophecy as Daniel begins to interpret it. Verse 15, nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass. That would be a fence, by the way. Fence in, put a fence around the stump of the tree. In the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. So the tree is to be cut down, but they are to put a fence around the stump of the tree. Now, the contemplation of the king's dream, verses 16 and verse 17. Whoop. Now, I'm going to keep going. All right, here we go. Revelation of the vision. Let his portion be with the beast in the grass. Let his heart be changed. Let a beast's heart be given unto him. Let 7 times or 7 years pass over him. So the beginning of the interpretation of the dream is this, that the heart of this tree will be changed from being a man to being a beast. And 7 times or 7 years will pass over him. Now the purpose of the vision, this matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth. So what was God's intent? God's intent by the dream and the interpretation of the dream was for Nebuchadnezzar as the king to come to a full knowledge and understanding that the Most High rules. You know, and so I go back to what happened yesterday evening with our president, President Trump, former President Trump. And we can pray that that bullet that just grazed him might be the very tool that God would use to move the heart of this president to turn to the Lord. What a difference that could make. And so again, the Most High ruleth. Now, then Daniel's troubled thoughts. Remember, he's there to give the interpretation of the dream to a king that can say with just a whim, off with your head. So you don't want to cross a man that has absolute power and authority. And so Daniel's thoughts then were troubled. And here's the effect of that dream. Verse 19. Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour. That is, he was so overwhelmed, he couldn't even speak. And his thoughts troubled him. And then the king spake, and he said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered, and he said, my lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. I'm going to keep going and bring you to the explanation of the dream. So Daniel is going to begin telling the king, this is what your dream means and what it means to you. And so Daniel 4 verse 20, the tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwell, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king. So there is the revelation. And so we have the dream. Now we've had the repeat of that dream. Now we're getting the interpretation of that dream. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, saying, hew the tree down, destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band or a fence of iron and brass in the tender grass. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven till 7 times pass over it. Verse 24, this then is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men. Thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen. They shall wet thee with the dew of heaven. 7 times, 7 years shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The overriding is God's sovereignty, God's purpose, God's plan. You're the tree. You'll be cut down. Your enemies are going to drive you out of the palace. You're going to live in the field. Literally, the picture here is you're going to be fenced in like a beast in the field. Now, there's some things that come up in my mind when I read something like this. One would be, why didn't they just kill him? You know? I'm not trying to be gross, but I'm just saying, you would think he's a nut and somebody else would aspire to the throne, right? I mean, that's the culture. But that didn't happen. And the only thing you can say is he wasn't killed for 7 years because of God's sovereignty. What else could it be? I can't come up with another explanation. And so you come to visit the palace of Nebuchadnezzar and you say, we're the king. And you would say, the nut's in the backyard and he's eating grass, And he spent 7 years doing that. And so it's an amazing thing. But it took 7 years for Nebuchadnezzar to acknowledge that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. What preceded this was Nebuchadnezzar looking and boasting at all that he had built. The city of Babylon was surrounded by 3 walls. The exterior wall was wide enough that 3 chariots could go around the wall on the top of the wall. Just imagine that. Within the city, it was 14-mile square. So it was a very large city. And of course, there was one famous landmark besides the ziggurat, the tower. But there was one other famous landmark in the city. Anybody know what it was? The Hanging Gardens, right, the Hanging Gardens. And so this king had built during his 43-year reign to bring water to the upper levels of his palace and have gardens that were watered because he had married a wife that came from a place like that. And so he was trying to please her. And so the beauty of this city is beyond comprehension. And Nebuchadnezzar said, look what I built, right? Moving on, the exhortation for Nebuchadnezzar to repent of his sins. Now this took boldness. It's one thing to say, King, you're going to be a nut. They're going to put you out for 7 years. They're going to put a fence around you. But Daniel, I think out of his love for Nebuchadnezzar, pleads with him. Notice what he prays. Wherefore, O King, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Break off thy sins by righteousness, thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility or thy peace. What we should pray today is that there will be some people around Donald Trump, President Trump, that will say, President, please look to God. It could change the course of our nation. And so I think we should pray to that end. So Daniel, being a godly man, he says, King, break off thy sins. What a great exhortation. Moving on. Notice, if you would, and this will start wrapping up the close, 5 divine attributes I wanted to show you in Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation. The first is that God is patient. A whole year would pass before Nebuchadnezzar would be cut down and driven out of the palace. 1 whole year. He had 1 year to turn to the Lord. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. But sadly, he had not learned. And the king spake, and he says, it's not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, the honor of my majesty. It's an echo of Lucifer, right? I will arise. I will be like. It's an echo of that sinful pride that is such a part of our world. And so God is patient. He waited for 12 months before Nebuchadnezzar was driven out. And then secondly, that God is just. Verse 31 and 33. The king had not humbled himself or turned from his sinful ways. And so we read in verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, his boasting, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. Now, pause and think about that. Look at the last few years, because I do believe that God is the sovereign of the nations. I believe that God is the sovereign of the U.S., of Russia, of the Ukraine, of China. God is sovereign of all nations. And so we look at our times, and there's things about our times that are disturbing, but we still have to go back and remember God is sovereign. So the king had exceeded God's patience. And then we come to the thought, while the words were in his mouth, he heard the voice from heaven, the kingdom is departed. You know, I would say to you, and again, I'm not trying to make it political, but I am trying to draw some parallels. 3.5 years ago, our president learned that the kingdom of the United States was departed. And in many ways, he was put out to pasture, right? Really was. Now, 3.5 years have passed. We've watched for a year constant attacks. And I don't know about you, but I would think, man, I think I would just go away and retire, right? And kind of sit back and enjoy my billions of dollars. But it's interesting how God is working, I think, in our culture. God's justice is as sure as his love is another thing I wanted to share with you. Certainly as God is just, we might also understand that God is loving. And then quickly, Daniel 4:32, they shall drive thee from men, thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, which we've already gone through this and rehearsed it, until thou know, here's what the lesson is, Nebuchadnezzar, until you know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and he giveth it to whomsoever he will. I guess I would say to us men, Nebuchadnezzar's, we've got a lot in common with him. He was hard-headed. It took 7 years of living in a pasture before he finally said, I submit to you. I acknowledge you're the God of heaven. Verse 33, the same hour then was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men. He did eat grass as oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws. In other words, he was a mess. He was an absolute mess. 7 years that he really went without anyone seeming to care for him. And then God is merciful. The 7 years would pass until Nebuchadnezzar finally would turn his heart to the Lord. And we read, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, I lifted up my eyes into heaven, my understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praised and I honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. Do you get his testimony here? The wonderful thing I want to point out with you, he was what we would say today diagnosed as insane. 7 years. He's insane. But his sanity was restored when he lifted his eyes to heaven and he acknowledged the Most High God. I wonder, in our culture where I think 50% or more people are on psychological drugs in our culture now, I wonder how many would not need those pharmaceuticals if they would just turn their hearts to heaven and acknowledge God. We probably have all had temptations of being a nut spiritually, off, not God-centered and Christ-centered and Word-centered. And you have to admit, when you depart from the ways of the Lord, there is a certain insanity that sets in, isn't there? And so we have to acknowledge that. It gives us sometimes you look at people and you say, that guy's a nut. Well, he really is a nut if he doesn't turn to the Lord and acknowledge him. Verse 35, I'm almost done. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according, this is speaking of the Lord, according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? No one has a right to charge God and demand, what are you doing? And his doing is always that which is his will. And by the way, his will is for his glory and my what? And my good, Romans 8, 28 and 29, to them that love him and are called according to his purpose. And then fourthly, God is gracious. The 7 years, and the Lord restored him to the throne of Babylon. And we read Daniel 4:36, mine honor and my brightness returned unto me. Wow, it's a wonderful testimony of restoration. I'm going to keep moving. I'm almost done. And then the fact that God is sovereign. I'll close with this. Verses 35 through 37. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. The last part of that verse. None can stay this hand or say unto him, what doest thou? God is sovereign. Verse 37. Those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. And then finally, Deuteronomy 4:39. Know therefore this day, and consider it in thine heart, that the Lord, he is God, in heaven above and upon the earth beneath, and there is none else. Psalm 135 and verse 6, whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did he, in heaven and in earth, in the seas, and all deep places. I close with this challenge to you, and we've got a couple of minutes, and it is this. What happened yesterday was awful. They'll be talking about it 50 years from now, about what happened yesterday in Pennsylvania. But you and I as believers, we need to be settled on this, that God is sovereign. And we rest in that. He did whatever he pleased. I believe he moved the bullet just enough. Can you imagine being grazed on your ear and how close that was to taking your life? For me, that's sobering. And God is sovereign. I wish I could say that President Trump is going to lead us like what would the word be? Like a godly man. And he might, if he humbles himself to God.